Good morning. This meeting is being conducted pursuant to New York State Open Meetings Law, Public Offices Law, Section 100, etc. It's SEC, I should say. For purposes of this meeting, I'm designating Julia Lee as our recording secretary. Today we have before us consideration of the following proposed amendments to Board Rules Section 1-02 and 1-15, and then Board Rules 1-13C, and then 1-13E and F. Let's begin with Board Rules 1-02 and 1-15. We have before us consideration of proposed amendments to Board Rules 1-02 and 1-15. Maybe I'll ask Chris to say 2-3 sentences worth about what we're doing here with community boards, and then we'll open up for general discussion.
Yes, happy to. In its 3 decades of advising community board members on the application of Chapter 68 to their conduct as members, the board has issued 18 advisory opinions totaling 116 pages of discussion and analysis. This proposed rule on community board service incorporates, which returns to the board, incorporates the feedback from the board by addressing each of these opinions. The proposed rule codifies 10 of those opinions and provides additional precision where some of the opinions speak only in generalities.
Okay, so for those 12, essentially this codifies or synthesizes, puts all in one place, what essentially had been distributed over 12 different documents.
Exactly.
Okay, open it up for discussion. I had 2 extremely minor points in the statement of basis and purpose. So that, I think that's Exhibit 3 on page 2. I thought if you go starting the lines 23 and forward, thought it would read better if it's broken into 2 sentences.
Okay.
So put a period at the end of members at the end of line 24.
Yes.
And then start with the board recognizes at 25.
Okay.
And then I also thought just to sort of follow up on some discussion we had earlier about we're doing those 12 and those 12 only. On line 28, where it says into a single rule that codifies the board's interpretation, I would say these board interpretations.
Okay.
Just to make it absolutely clear that we're talking about these and nothing else.
Yes.
So I said these, I think it's a very minor point, but I thought it was, consistent with where we're going. And the other extremely minor point is on page 4 of Exhibit 3, line 4. I think it should be an is and not an are. As a community board member,
Yes.
whom the license liquor fee is not prohibited. And then I would insert a the in line 6, because any impact on the member's interests.
Yes.
That's all I have. So I'm open to further, more substantive discussion, but that's all I have. Substantive or non-substantive discussion.
I had a couple minor points along those lines. On page 7 of Exhibit 3, where we break out the additional advisory opinions that we're not incorporating, which I thought was a very good addition. Thank you for doing that.
Thanks.
We have the 3 bullets, and then the conclusion wrap-up paragraph is sort of included in the 3rd bullet. Should that just be better as its own paragraph?
Yes, I can certainly break that out.
That's all. And then on page
Means
9.
that the board can address that sentence?
I
Oh,
think
go ahead.
that
Well, I
is
actually
actually,
thought it's all 3.
yeah, I think that's all related to that 3rd bullet.
It's all related to the 3rd bullet, not
I-
the 3 bullet, not all.
Right, because the
8
third
bullets.
bullet is
Rules?
specific, it's talking
Okay.
about 3 advisory opinions in which community board members had positions at these other governmental or quasi-governmental entities, and the board had, in advisory opinions, described, how and when somebody could do that, and these are situations where we're talking about a very tiny number of people, and the circumstances are specific in each case, which seems like a better match to the board's regular waiver process, rather
see.
because it's
Okay.
doing this as a rule wouldn't just be a rule.
I read it too quickly because the way I read it read almost as like a conclusory paragraph to that whole sentence, to that whole section. So you're saying those last couple sentences, in lines 26 to 32, only relate to the third bullet in those three opinions?
Exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. Then you can leave it as is then.
I'd like to just discuss something that's substantive along those lines. The question of prohibiting city employees and other agencies or entities from voting on community boards. I think it's wise. The Board of Ethics thought it was advisable to do that. But is that grounded in Chapter 68? To the extent that if somebody does vote on a matter involving his agency, he violates Chapter 68? Is it a violation of this rule that is punishable? Not chairing a committee where your agency may come before that committee 3 times. I'm not sure where this comes from. And then the including in this list, not only people who work for the city, but people who work for related agencies, public benefit corporations, and the like that are listed in that paragraph. Those are entities that we define not to be firms, and therefore a city employee who has an involvement or an association with one of those entities can appear before his own entity and does not have a conflict in the normal course of events. And yet we're changing this and sort of flipping it on its head for community boards. I understand why we're doing this, and to some extent it's a larger question where the city council's legislation requiring us to codify has forced us to be very, very specific in do's and don'ts rather than advice as to what might be best practice. So I have some issue as to whether, do we need to include that in these rules, or could we be more general in advice? And simply saying, it's discouraged, it's probably a bad idea to vote on things you're involved in. I think it can go both ways. One, it's not comfortable to vote against your agency. On the other hand, it may look like you're in the tank for your agency. But the charter does allow 25% of members of community boards to be city employees. So I think to some extent we're creating this out of whole cloth. And I just wonder whether we need to codify this with the specificity that we are doing, or whether we could say something more general in a rule saying we advise or advised not to vote on matters involving your agency, or disclose it, or something of that sort. But I think we're creating here a new category of violation and prescription, and spend a lot of time on it in our rules. I have some little reservation about doing that. I don't know how others feel. But I do have that reservation.
Jeff, to be specific, just so you know exactly which proposed rule you're discussing. Are you talking about page 5, line 5, that's 1-15B?
It appears in a number of places.
Right, so this has been
Yeah.
the board's advice about this since, prior to this board, going back to the Board of Ethics. I think the first opinions of the Board of Ethics holding this view were from the 1970s, if I remember correctly. But this board has, for its entire almost 30-year history, this has been what the board has said B2 means in this context. And so it would be a big change to not interpret B2 this way. This rule is codifying those advisory opinions to capture that longstanding advice.
I understand that.
Let me just intervene. So I think Jeff's first question is, what's the source of our authority for doing this? And your answer is?
2604 B2.
Which states, just to get on the record?
Sure, yeah, right. It essentially says that public servants cannot engage in conduct in which they have a private interest that would prevent the proper discharge of their duties, would conflict with the proper discharge of
So
their
the
duties.
argument here is, again, is the usual problem of serving two masters. You have your city agency's perspective, and there's the sense of what might be best from the community board perspective. So it's a classic conflicts type situation.
Right. Well, right, and the challenge here is identifying the private interest, and the private interest has always been identified as being when you have these two positions, and they are not part of the same position. They're really two separate positions. That you have private interest in holding those two jobs that can conflict with one another.
And just one other question, sorry, because it has to do with the fact we've seen this before, just confirming, how much of this is completely new? In other words, Exhibit 3 is a markup of something, so is it only a markup of a prior draft of ours, or is it a markup of the existing rule?
No, there is no existing rule. This is
Okay.
a prior
Okay,
mark.
so this is
markup
all
of
new,
our-
just to-
Yeah,
just
yes,
to-
the rule is absolutely new. It is, but it is almost entirely just codifying.
Oh, that is clear from Exhibit 4,
Yeah.
okay. That's
And yes, and the markup is what
well,
is
of the prior
changed
draft.
since
Got
the
it, got it,
March
got
meeting.
it, got it. So the focus, I guess, is on subsection B, right? Other government and quasi-government service.
B2 does talk about private interests, financial or other private interests. It doesn't, I mean, it's a little, we talk about on page 5, Exhibit 3, we say, B2 prohibits a public servant from having a position or engaging, the word position, that doesn't appear in B2. B2 talks about private interests.
Are you
outside.
referring to,
Yeah.
I understand, conceptually I agree with you, but are you saying that a financial interest, in effect, even though you are a public employee, you are employed by an agency and you rely for your financial sustenance on the work that you perform for that agency, and so you may have a loyalty to that agency to vote a certain way that's not.
Sure, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be financial. Simply having a position, an unpaid position, frequently can be something that you have a private interest in.
But you receive compensation for the
You do,
position
yes.
at that agency, and you might feel that you can't vote against that agency's
Correct.
interests in your position on the community board.
Correct.
I'm just,
I understand.
that's, yeah.
I think it's the issue, or just so I'm clear what we're talking about, that you're talking about the same things, but you're saying it's the distinction between an advisory opinion and actually codifying it as a rule. That's all.
Right,
the
we've
issue
made
is.
this a very firm rule, very specific do's and don'ts. When, before that, it was essentially advice. If you are employed by an agency and the matter comes before the board, don't vote on it.
I
But
feel
here,
like if that's what we're saying, we
did-
should say that.
If you did do that, then are we saying you violated chapter 68? And we can
Yeah.
But that is what those,
Yes.
we have
Yeah,
said that.
Yes, that's what I'm
that's the
saying.
point.
Have we prosecuted people
Yes.
for?
Yes.
Okay.
Jeff, what are we losing by being clear?
Wiggle room.
Right, I mean, can you conceive of situations where it would be appropriate for an arguably conflicted, say, city deputy commissioner or city civil servant to vote on a matter of that agency's, relevant to that agency's work, on that person serving on a community board? Because the difference between saying we think it's a bad idea and it violates the rules is you think there are some situations where we would approve it.
Yeah, I see this more as a conflict of position rather than a conflict of interest where there's
So
no real
let's see the
private
difference.
interest. But if there is, a strong precedent for this, well then, that's different. I just question whether this is grounded in 2604B2.
Yeah, there's this,
Which seems to me to deal with your outside private interests.
right, this is why we, like, the official fundraising rule that the board implemented, there is no private interest for official fundraising, but the board promulgated a rule that said you violate 2604B2 by asking someone to donate to the city, to your own city agency or to a city affiliated not-for-profit if you don't follow these prescriptions. Even though you don't have a position with the not-for-profit, even though you're not benefiting in any way. And the board found that to be a B2 rule violation and promulgated that thing. This is very similar. If the board, you know, your concerns are not, or if the board wanted to do that, the board would just have to decide that the advisory opinion's no longer held. Because I don't think it's, this institution has been telling community board members who serve other city agencies for decades that they can't vote and that they can't, you know, so that would be, we have to say explicitly the opposite to be true. Just to give people guidance, because people just need clear rules.
No, I agree on that. It's a bright line rule and it's very specific. I guess if you thought you were entitled to some waiver for some reason, you would bring it up in advance. I don't know what you would come up with in advance to request that, but I'm in favor of taking the advisory opinion that's always been the case and saying, you know, everyone, it's not just advice, here are the rules of the road, and, you know, conduct yourself accordingly. I don't see the real difference either. It's just making it a rule. I think it's better, but it's not a huge distinction from what we've been doing.
I can also say that the feedback that we have received in talking to agency leaders and elected officials around the city over this last year or so, has very much, as community boards have been a subject of some discussion, has very much been a concern that community board members be held to a very high standard with regard to conflicts of interest issues, including this issue. That this is something that, you know, borough presidents are concerned about community board members, and they're, you know, working on their community boards on matters related to their other city positions, in addition, of course, to their private positions and so forth.
It helps the member too. You mentioned, Jeff, you know, this concern, you're almost damned if you do vote in favor of something, you know, that involves your agency, and you're damned if you don't, personally, so it just avoids putting people in that position altogether.
And to that point, we do receive on, you know, by phone, by email, many questions, you know, probably dozens of questions a year on, you know, community board members reaching out, you know, for both, you know, this, you know, on this very question.
Yeah, I think it would almost be counterproductive if we didn't include this. If we're basically presenting a clarification and guideline on all our community board rules, and we don't include this rule that we've applied for 30 years, it would probably add more confusion. To your point, Jeff, I think, Jeff, maybe I would probably, to your concern, I see that concern being addressed when there's a violation, and you weigh that in the penalty, right, given the circumstances. Now that it's clear, depending on the nature of the violation, then you can weigh that in the terms of enforcement. But I think your concern is outweighed by the goal here, which is to provide clarity to these community board members that these are the rules that you've been following for 30 years, they're all in one place, and everybody's on the same page, and they don't have to fish through a dozen AOs to figure out what they have to do to stay to the right side of Chapter 68.
I guess analytically, I would see this really as a rule to be promulgated on conduct of community boards by borough presidents or others. Not really a 2604 violation, but I am not advocating necessarily overturning what we've been doing, if in fact we've been enforcing this for years.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I will stick with the stare decisis.
I guess also what it grows out of, maybe you can give me some other examples. I mean, I think what Jeff is appropriately stuck on is the language in 26.4b2 about financial other private interests. And in what sense it's a private interest. And I take it we've been treating private as a term of art, as not the interest of this public slot. And we have had other situations in which the conflict was from another public position, which was in some sense private relative to this one. And is that our position? In other words, so I hear Jeff saying that the problem is that we're pushing 26.4b2, because the public servant shall not engage in any business transaction or private employment or of any financial other private interest. That the other city job is in effect a private interest. But it is a private interest in a term of art sense, in that it's different from the community board interest. That's, I take it, our position.
Right, I think that's exactly right.
Right.
We have, for example, The board provided a waiver to a public servant, not in the B2 context, but in the B6 context, which is the prohibition against appearing before the city on behalf of a private interest for a public servant who was working for a state senate office.
We had that case not that long ago.
Right,
And the fact that he needed a waiver
Right.
meant that the behavior was otherwise covered.
Precisely, and the term is the same, private interest. The board also has a history of trying to deal with this issue when it's trying to sort out whether or not the position is really separate from their other city positions. So there is a line of cases, advice, where the public servant, by virtue of the role they have, perform a number of other roles in the city, and those don't conflict because
Because
they're
that's, ex
of a
officio
piece.
is one thing.
Right.
But this is so, I don't know if it's worth putting in this, probably not, but just for our own internal understanding, to the extent that the sticking point is private, we're treating private to include public when it's other than the public position in question, right?
Correct.
Which makes it not inconsistent, means that it really does follow from B2, as well as following from the prior advisory opinions.
Precisely.
Just want to make sure I understood that right.
Are you suggesting an amendment to the?
No,
Oh,
I
was
mean,
gonna say, 'cause what you said was confusing to write down.
Right, I mean, I'm wondering whether it would be, I mean, I'm thinking out loud, not proposing whether we want to put into the statement of purpose a little bit of that, or leave it, or not bother. Because right now, when the excerpt of B2 is a little chopped up. I mean, you've edited out most of it, because it doesn't on its face obviously support the position. And I'm inclined to not bother, but I just, now that Erica has sort of pushed me a little bit on it, I would, I'll put it out there.
Okay, I have a question, I think it's related, maybe not. Let's say we didn't make any changes, here. If I'm a community board member and I look at the rule, can I still go look at the AOs and get a little more flavor? I mean, how does that?
Certainly the AO, I mean, the AOs are public because they're supposed to be, educational
Right.
documents.
But
and
as of this rule, how much?
They're not,
Wait,
right,
okay.
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, the pursuant to this city charter, the advisory opinion only applies to the public servant
Who
who
it was
sought the
issued, right,
advice. And so, any public servant can read the advisory opinion to get an understanding of what the board's thought was at that point in time in advising that public servant, but there's no authoritative weight behind it as
Which is
applied
where
to
we
that
are
public servant.
before the rule
Which is why,
anyway.
exactly,
And we're
which is,
still there after.
yes,
yeah.
and which is the impetus for
Putting the rule
the
in
recent
first place.
charter revision that
Yeah.
that is the impetus for this codification project. We, in addition to having the advisory opinions available, and certainly the statement of basis and purpose addresses each of the advisory opinions so that the public servants would know which advisory opinions the board is codifying and which the board would limit to the facts at hand or limit to the public servant who requested. Any public servant, any community board member can call us at any time, can reach out to us, can email us, and we are happy to provide that informal advice as to the interpretation of the rules to that public servant.
Okay,
Okay.
so they're not invocable by us, but they're certainly part of the legal history of the board.
Yes.
Well, we should have some, I guess when we finish with this process, some educational process to let public servants understand. You look at these rules, not necessarily at the old advisory opinions.
Yes.
And maybe even in our publication, we might have a notice to that effect.
Yes.
So when people look at the website and do research, that they understand exactly what has happened.
Yes.
It doesn't change.
Would it say codified in XYZ or?
Potentially.
Okay.
Are we ready to vote? Ready to end discussion, I should say, and then vote. Okay, I call for a motion that the board adopt the recommended amendment to board's rules 1-02 and 1-15 as the final rule, with the extremely modest modifications to statement of basis and purpose that I mentioned earlier. That's the motion that I call for. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? None? The motion for adoption of the proposed amendments as presented as the final rule with the extremely modest modifications has passed. Thank you.
What is the next step?
Yes, so the next step is with this approval, this gets submitted to the law department and the mayor's office of operations pursuant to CAPA. And they will review it. If there are any changes to it, it will come back to the board, before a public hearing is noticed and scheduled. And so it will, you know, be back here, with any changes that the law department, and mayor's office of operations
If there are no
proposes.
changes?
If there are no changes, it would get scheduled as for a public hearing.
Now, the board members do not attend public hearings?
Board members are invited to attend, but the CAPA does not require board members to attend.
I was present for one.
Yeah.
Okay, let us move on to our second item. Do you want to switch?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so these, we're now considering, sorry, we're considering amendments to board rules, to board rule section 1-13. Again, Claire, can you set the scene for us for the couple of sentences?
Yeah. The board recently passed Board Rules 1-13E, which permits agency heads to designate public servants to perform work on behalf of not-for-profits as part of their official city duties. The proposed Board Rules 1-13C would serve as a companion to Board Rules 1-13E, providing similar guidance to public servants who wish to engage in volunteer work on behalf of not-for-profits in their personal capacity. Charter Section 2604C6 already addresses public servants who hold volunteer positions at not-for-profits. There's no Chapter 68 provision that addresses public servants whose personal volunteer work doesn't rise to the level of being a position at a not-for-profit. The proposed rule would fill this void, laying out the conditions under which a public servant may perform this non-position personal volunteer work without running afoul of the conflicts of interest law. Finally, the proposed rule would update and streamline the current Board Rules 1-13C, which allows public servants to use a limited amount of city time and city resources for board-approved personal volunteer work.
So this would be somebody like an, staff member of the Conflicts of Interest Board wanting to join to work with the Riverside Parks Conservancy on weekends to clean up trash in the park. And would not be an officer of the Conservancy, but would be just somebody scraping leaves and picking up garbage.
Yeah, the first part would deal with those non-positions. The second part, the updating and streamlining, would deal with both position and non-position.
And so that person could be on the phone a couple of times to a coordinator saying, I'm available this Saturday, but not next Saturday, or something like that.
Yeah, or potentially attend board meetings on city times.
Okay. Consistent with my focus on the petty, I have a couple of very minor things. We're just looking out of Exhibit 2. Again, the statement basis and purpose on the fourth line. Should be engaged in business dealings, not engaged. That's a typo.
Yep.
Okay. Instead of engaged is, and I think on page 5 on the third line, I think the end of it should be to act and not to acts.
Yes.
Like I said, instinct for the capillaries and not the jugular here. But,
I have a question, I have clarification. What is the distinction between business dealings? Like, when do business dealings cross over into communications, or maybe vice versa? When does a communication cross over into business dealings? So I am allowed as a volunteer to deal with other city agencies on behalf of the nonprofit.
Yes.
I can communicate, I can be involved in seeking permits, I can do certain things, but I cannot involve in business dealings. What
Yes.
is, what is the rule there? Where the-
Well, so business is that's a defined term, so it's essentially any sort of real transaction with the city Right,
Transactional.
yeah, right, and license and permits are two examples right out of that definition.
Well, then, this is, I thought I was confused about that, because in the example, unless I'm misreading it. Wait, a permit and a license is a business dealing,
Yes,
or it's not?
it is. So let me,
It's
sorry
not.
to be clear, it
Okay.
is, what you might be thinking about is what is a ministerial communication. And so the term, when you are appearing before the city, the kind of appearances that are exempted from the conflicts of interest prohibitions are those that are called ministerial. And those are ones where the city does not engage in any personal discretion. It's not really making a decision about the thing. So you can imagine a permit where, all you need is a check for $50,
Right, well,
your
the
driver's
example
license,
of
and
getting for the youth baseball league, getting a permit from the city for the youth baseball league, whatever it is. The example is getting a permit, but you're saying that's not a sufficiently, like, discretionary type license versus, I don't know, I want it to be a contractor or something, and I have to show education or certain other background.
Yeah, like, be the applicant on record, like, a lot of DOB permits are considered a very extensive process to get those permits. So that would be being involved in the business dealings with the city, whereas something that is just generally handed out automatically, once you fill in the information, wouldn't necessarily be considered business dealings with the city.
I don't know, this was a little confusing to me, and I do feel like I know the difference between a ministerial communication or an appearance versus what I consider like a business dealing, but I don't know if it's just the juxtaposition when you go from little, what does Chris call these little, two
Romanette.
little I?
Romanettes.
But when you go from Romanette 2 to 3, you take no part in the business dealings with the city. But you don't communicate with your own agency, and then the example that's given is actually, I don't know, someone could say, requesting a permit. So I don't know if it just needs a little clarification that kind of a
So,
permit application is different, because I would read that to say, oh, well, then I could apply for permits and licenses then on behalf of my agency I'm volunteering for. And I wouldn't necessarily make the distinction, certain kinds of permits, but not other kinds of
got it.
permits.
So let's just walk through 2 and 3 so I make sure I'm understanding what your concern is. So 2 is saying that the public servant is going to take no part in the not-for-profit's business dealings with the city, either right in their
Right.
city job
I don't-
or
yeah.
at the
Yeah.
not-for-profit. And then
Which makes sense.
okay,
Yeah.
and then 3 is saying that in addition to that public servant who is volunteering is not gonna communicate
With their own
with their own
agency,
city agency.
right.
And I apologize. We're not actually using the term appear here. You're just not
Same,
talking to your
right,
city
I get that
agency at
part.
all.
Yeah, I
right?
get that part.
But other
Broader. It's
Right.
broad,
Yeah.
right, but broader, but limited to
But
your
narrow,
city
because I
agency.
can communicate with any other city agency.
Right, because again, you
To the
don't
point
have a
short of business dealings.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
Right.
that's
And you
my
don't-
question, is what is the point short of, is it just, look, go to the definition and don't do anything up to that point? You can communicate as much as you want to, you can appear, you could seek permits and licenses, but not to the point where it becomes a business dealing.
Right,
Yep.
in fact, you're hitting on something that's very difficult for us. That's a legal question that we deal with all the time.
Oh, is it? Sorry to raise.
But
Sorry
I'm
to
saying
raise.
that's not easily collapsible into
I
a
gotcha.
rule. Because we try to hit that line where like asking for a permit to be in a park is different from, as Claire's example, asking for a sidewalk cut on a permit to cut the sidewalk differently in front of your building.
I
They're
wouldn't
both
know
are
that,
called
though. I wouldn't know
permits.
that.
Right,
Yeah.
but we answer those questions all the time, and we have to deal with
Gotcha.
the agency and find out how the agency handles those things. Some things are
Exactly, is it just X
ministerial.
number of permits per season, which is probably the park, versus something different about the side cut, you know?
Right.
Well,
More
Right.
discretionary.
It's like-
So if there's a program funded by the city, it's okay for someone to volunteer as part of that program.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
just
Yeah,
one.
we're right, we're trying to like get away from the kinds of things that we've come up with where like I'm an umpire at a city park for a youth league, and there's a parks employee who I need equipment from. Is that like a
I
prohibited
can't even go over and
communication?
collect my
Right, we don't-
17
we
bats
wanna, like,
because-
Right.
make sure that
Right.
that's clear that that's.
Well, that,
okay.
yeah, that seems easy. I
Right.
wouldn't call that, no one's gonna call that a business dealing, I don't think.
Well,
Right.
But I don't know, but it's
well, the issue is, do we need to clarify that a little more? Like,
Yeah,
look,
what is-
they are performing a service funded by the city.
Right, you're just not you're not negotiating
That's
that
right.
service or anything like that. You're just a volunteer who's showing up to the baseball game and umping the game or whatever. Reffing again?
Would it help to add to Romanet
What's the
2
term?
some, we have a definition for business
Yeah.
certificate law?
No, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No.
I was making a dumb joke, I apologize.
This-
It wasn't funny.
Something like contracts, a little bit of language into Romanet 2.
maybe an EG and, yeah, and I
For
think
example.
it would, not, yeah,
Permits,
not an
transactions.
exhaustive thing,
Not an
but just
exhaustive list, but something to
at least
make
to
it
give
clear.
somebody a
Yes.
heads up,
Okay.
red
Yeah.
flag,
Yeah.
that when I'm doing this, it might be something I need to check versus,
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Something
that's-
else.
Because
So we'll take a crack at that, yeah.
Because business dealings, as I read it, is very broad.
Right.
The actual
It-
definition of business dealings, any license, permit, grant, or benefit. So I think we're talking about substantial business dealings here.
Right,
And maybe we need,
that's
and maybe we need to have a definition in maybe in a rule, or in the statement of basic purpose, what do you mean by substantial? I
What
mean,
was it again, Richard? It was
it's,
license.
any transaction with the city involving the sale, purchase, rental, disposition, or exchange of any goods, services, or property, any license, permit, grant, or benefit. So that having the Parks Department guy unlock the equipment shed to put out the nets and the balls for soccer,
Right. So
that's
we've-
arguably in it.
Right, so we've interpreted it the way that you're thinking
Right.
that it should be, right?
Right.
That it's a right, and so that's the way the board has always interpreted business dealing, not to include, to Anthony's point, the getting the equipment out of the
But I don't know
shed.
that we
or
wanna
whatever.
create a new standard of substantial business dealing. You might wanna say that business dealings would not include.
Right, right.
non-discretionary permits, I would not include that, or
Yeah.
something, or
Why
would
don't we,
include.
why don't we try to take a crack at some language, either in the commentary or in the Romanet 2, and
Yeah.
come back to the board on that?
Right. I mean, maybe there's some notion of de minimis, or I don't know if you, versus substantial, or I don't, because I think trying to actually spell out the things that aren't covered is not gonna work. Well, maybe you can try it, but I
Yeah, an
think,
example,
I think
yeah.
the universe is so big that I think you do have to go either the substantial or the de minimis.
Or
one way
maybe
or
an
the other.
example in the statement of basis and purpose.
I mean, maybe,
Like explaining the reference to the business purpose, the business.
although again, if the whole point of this is to give clarity to public servants, they're not gonna read the statement of basis and purpose. That's not the rule.
That's true.
Should be the rule.
Yeah,
Right.
let us see,
Well, let's-
yeah,
yeah,
let
we'll
us see
try
if we
to
can
see
come
if
up
we
with
can
some
put
language
something.
and we'll bring that back.
Okay.
Yeah,
You might want to do something about ordinary interaction with city staff or program staff,
right.
for which it would be expected for volunteers to
Yeah.
engage in. So asking
Or-
about a door be unlocked, you can't do your volunteer job unless the door is unlocked and get equipment.
I guess, so my question is actually, I'm about to say non-ministerial, how do we see the relationship between business dealings and ministerial matters? Because ministerial matters includes the issuance of a license, permit, or other permission. So it does seem to me there's a potential overlap between business dealings and ministerial matters. So maybe we just want to say non-ministerial business dealings. I mean, we don't have to do it right now, but you might want to think about that, so that asking
that.
the parks guy to open up the equipment shed, we would treat as ministerial.
That's ministerial.
Yeah, I mean, maybe, I'm just trying to think of a simple way to do it. And since we have
That
both
makes sense.
ministerial or business dealings other than for ministerial matters, so as to not create new terminology, but to sort of have,
We're redefining ministerial.
Right.
Well, there's a continuum though
Right.
of what's
But I think that's-
ministerial.
but
what's
maybe
that
not.
if you, as you
closer to
think
what we're
about
trying
this,
to-
you can
Right.
weave in some reference, because I think that's where you were going when your explanation, so maybe it actually needs to be in the text.
Okay.
Further?
On
Yeah.
these rules. Little 2, whatever, paragraph 2 or at the end of, on page 7.
Mhm.
That's dealing with a situation
Oh, real
where
two.
an
Paragraph
agency,
two.
paragraph 2, agency head says you can go ahead and do this work because this is bar association work, I assume, and somewhere, it's very broadly stated. I mean, it advances professional development of the employee or benefits the public at large. So we're saying an agency head can say, you can use our resources to go out and do some volunteer work that benefits the city at large.
With the agency head approving that and the board approving it.
The board has to
My,
approve that?
yeah, is the board has to approve,
Last line.
last line, right, the board has to
Last line
approve to
requires
the, so there's a significant review process for getting the permission to use city time and resources to do this volunteer activity, where both the agency head and this board would have to approve it. But the idea is to try to capture, right, both the example you provided, right, of somebody's volunteering for a bar committee, and there's some professional development value to that, and so the agency head wants that attorney to be able to use a little bit of city time and resources to do that, because some of that stuff is happening during the sort of regular business day, but then also for other sorts of volunteer activities.
I don't know if this is covered, but the example I thought of, Jeff, because I looked at that too, I thought of, sometimes there's like volunteer week, or there's like some, citywide thing, and a whole office or a whole team might do something, or might be invited to do something. So unless there's, like, without that, unless there's some kind of a, waiver or something, like, you couldn't ever say, let's all go to the food bank and pack up, things, even though, or let's all go clean up at a city housing development because we work at, whatever. I just thought there could be times when you would want to have people able to take their day, but go do something, and you'd be prohibiting city employees from doing what private employees do.
Right,
At least once a year.
And quite a bit of people's volunteer work has to happen during business
You want
hours,
them to
and
be able
the
to
sort of
come,
quintessential
yeah.
example of pro bono work for professionals, it's almost impossible to avoid having some of that happen during the workday. So having some mechanism to allow that when it's, when essentially it's in the city's interest to do so, is what this is trying to capture. That's what the previous version was trying to capture. We were just trying to be more accurate about the kinds of things that reasons city agencies might legitimately want their employees to be using a little bit of city time and resources to do this sort of thing.
We say that you can use personnel, equipment, resources, and supplies, but not letterhead, title, or email accounts. Some of this stuff might require that. For your bar association work, you would use, I know I did, chair of bar association committee, and clearly if there's correspondence, it comes to the office. You're saying you could use your city time and resources, why not the email?
Because just like when you are communicating and you're using your city email address, in every other context, it's understood that that's a communication you're making officially. It is so incredibly easy to have a personal email account to deal with the personal things in your life that it just makes much more sense to just let public servants should just keep this stuff separate. Just like you can't use letterhead to communicate on behalf of anyone other than officially on behalf of the city. You can't use your title except when you are acting in your official capacity. Using a city email address is really pretty similar. And I think that's especially true in an age when you can have as many free email accounts as you want.
And I think, Jeff, we're trying to be more precise about volunteer activity. There's bar associations where if I was on the government ethics committee at the city bar association, that would not be my private bar association thing. It's not like me being on the family law committee. I'd be doing it as the executive director of the Conflict of Interest Board, and I'd use the mechanism that the board promulgated through 113E which would enable me to use city letterhead and city title and city email, because I'm doing it as part of my city job, and there'd be an official designation from the agency head, the board chair, saying that I could do that. But if I don't have that designation, then I'm doing it in my private capacity. And that should also be clear, that I shouldn't be using any of those designations of my official citydom in this private activity. So there's two ways that you could be on a bar association. One, as part of your city job. Second, purely personal. For which there's a separate rule for each.
I noticed some of the, I mean, I get these chairs waiver letters, and one of the first things I noticed years ago was many city employees teach on off hours. And the one unwavering rule we have is they can teach, but they can't use their city email for communications with their students. They have to, because otherwise it turns it into an official city relationship. So I think it's a fairly straightforward assumption.
If we do that, shouldn't we add that to little 1 as well? So we say, public servant, nor shall the public servant use city letterhead. We probably should add to that title or email address
That
as well.
makes sense, actually.
Yeah.
'Cause that seems to be
Yeah, that
more-
makes sense.
Yeah, because that's one of the things they don't likely use.
Yeah.
I guess I'm dated somewhat, because when I did this, many people used their city accounts that didn't have personal accounts necessarily. And so one used your city account for official and quasi-official activities as well, like bar associations. But I guess it's different today.
Any more comments? So to sum up, I think, before I call for some final action, there are a couple of minor changes, the two that I gave and the one that Jeff suggested in terms of putting the title or email language in Romanet 1 on page 7. I think those are all of the actual, plus we're gonna hand it back to the staff to think more on the relationship between some kind of ministerial exception to the business dealings limitation. Having said all that, I call for a motion that the board continue this discussion at a future board meeting, which would likely focus primarily on that point. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
A second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, the motion for continuation of discussion has passed. All right, and finally, we have before us consideration of the proposed amendments to Board Rules 1-13E and 1-13F. And once again, Chad, could you give us a brief setting of the stage?
So these are proposed amendments to Board Rules 113E, which, as previously discussed, addresses how public servants can be designated by their agency to use city time and city resources for work for an not-for-profit entity, and with approval of the board, be involved in that entity's business dealings with the city. And the proposed revisions to E are minor. It involves changing the word proposed activity in E1 Romanet 1 to work, which is more consistent with how we've been discussing this issue generally. It's less confusing for public servants. And then the second proposal is to...
So that's the whole change, Dave.
That's the whole change. And then to add a paragraph 3,
Okay.
which will more clearly break out the sorts of documents public servants are required to disclose to the board, and that the board will be posting as part of administrative this regime.
Okay.
That the board always intended the sorts of documents to be the designations from the agency heads, which would be public, and then in the instance of a public servant's involvement in the not-for-profit's work with the city agency, the board's determination. And the board staff experienced some confusion from public servants about how that was phrased in the rule as it exists, and just by breaking it out into this new section 3, we hope it to be a clearer signpost to public servants to know what will be happening with the documents that they're submitting. And that's the whole of the change to
Okay.
E. And the proposed changes to F, board staff actually proposes withdrawing those changes from this rule and the commentary just by deleting those two sections in order to revise it to more clearly accommodate new and proposed board rules. implicating 2604B2.
I'm
Yes.
confused.
Yeah,
confused
so,
too.
yeah, sorry, to make this clear, we wanna pull back our proposal
F?
on 113F because
Okay.
we feel we have, created a problem. Because we've created new rules, the fundraising rule, and potentially in the not too distant future, the community board rule, that are rules pursuant to B2. And, our draft did not take that into account, and so we have to fix this problem. So we'll bring this back to you when we've ironed that, problem out. Sorry for the,
So all you want us to consider is the
just the
amendments
E
to
for now,
Changes
yes,
to
please.
E.
Okay, I'm not sure there's much to say about E, but if there is, people should feel free to say it.
Should it be, should there be an and rather than an or in 3? Before designations made pursuant to paragraph 1 of the subdivision and.
Well, it's intended to be an inclusive or, and the reason is we didn't think that it was appropriate to post the, when an agency had requests, provides a designation of a public servant and requests approval from the board for that public servant to be involved in that not-for-profit's business dealings with the city, with their agency. We didn't think that putting that request online, making that public, was the right thing. That in those cases, it was actually the board's determination about that should be the public document. And so, because it was unclear whether or not, right, you've got a designation for people who are not going to be involved in the business dealings, that's a public.
That's gonna be online.
But then
That
you
would
have,
be online.
that would be
That would
online,
be over
absolutely.
online.
But then for the public servants who are getting a designation and a
To be
request,
involved.
what is it that we're putting online? We wouldn't put a waiver request online. So the idea is we're trying to be clear that in that case, we would only put the board's letter approving that online. Does that make sense? So it should be an or, because it's never gonna be, it's
Both.
never
You're not
gonna be
put
both.
both, the requests and the determination.
Otherwise, we'd have to force agencies to provide us with two documents, a designation
Also,
and
they
a-
might, we go back sometimes for additional information.
Correct.
And so then you're gonna put every single iteration of extra info they submit. I would
Right.
just do the final determination, which is gonna include everything.
That's right. It would be a major departure in the board's practice to post requests
Well, not
online.
requests, I'm just, where the agency designates you, it says you can do this work.
Yeah.
Not, we're not talking about the doing
Business
business
dealings,
dealings with the
right.
city. That will be where? That will
They'll be
Online.
online.
On our,
Yes.
we will post that.
Yes, we
Yep.
will post
Yes.
that.
But if the agency head says you can do this and we request that you do business dealings with the city, then only the final,
Only the board's final determination on that issue will be
and
public.
that's clear from this.
Is it only the final determination if we approve it, or is it the final determination if we say, no, sir, you can only do whatever the first part, no business dealings?
In the event that the board declines to issue permission for the folks to be
The
involved in
first
business
one
in the
would
city,
be on anyway.
we would probably, the best practice would be to go back and just get the designation for the public servant to do the work without the business.
And then
dealings,
that
so
would
there
be
would
online.
one clear document that doesn't include what would be a
You're
confusing
not
back
gonna
and
put a
forth.
denial online.
Right.
That's right.
So in some sense, the assumption is if it gets to the stage of a determination, that kind of subsumes the designation.
That's right.
So the determination sort of includes the designation, so
Right.
there's no need to do both.
Right.
But if we don't get to a determination, because it's only through paragraph 1, then that's what we put up.
That's
Right.
right.
Okay. Any further discussion? Okay, are we ready to vote on the amendments? Okay, so I now call for a motion that the board adopt the recommended amendment to Board Rule 1-13E and only 1-13E as the final rule.
So moved.
Second,
Second.
all in favor? Any opposed? The motion for adoption of the proposed amendment to 1-13E as presented as the final rule has passed. There being no further business for consideration pursuant to the open meetings law, this meeting is hereby adjourned.